So for the next session, we have risk assessment and disaster planning for Nadumudi. So this presentation will be presented by myself, Hariprasad, Kanishka, and Rohit. Me and Rohit are MTech scholars from Sitara. Hariprasad is a research scholar from Sitara, and Kanishka is a research scholar from CPS. First of all, we'll go through an introduction and more like a revision of what all happened so far. So first, we'll look at why do we need a local level disaster management. So so far, whatever disaster management policies or plans have done, it has always been a top down approach, as in the national level management would cater to the state level management, and then it will go to the district level. And the perception of disaster has always been something that happens suddenly, and not that something that happens recurring. So all the activities related to disaster management was also post disaster activities rather than mitigation or adaptation activities. And as I said, at national level frameworks, the lowest unit of planning was at district level. But we all know that district itself vary in characteristics, and we need much more smaller or micro level assessment. So we need a local level disaster management. So what is the important when local level governments come in, so this is more like a revision of what Neha ma'am from Kila had said. They'll be more accessible to the people, and it's considered as the direct foundation of democracy, and they know the place well and people well rather than the national level or state level management coming in, and they'll be the first respondents during a disaster. And Kerala's potential and experience for local level governance is very strong, so we have to actually make use of that. According to various literature, it has been said that for good local disaster management, there should be inclusion of existing knowledge and resources that is available in the community or that area, and there should be an awareness about the risk and vulnerability that is existing, and technical information and training related that should be given to the local governments and the associated people. And also, most importantly, the community has to be organized to mobilize people. So this will help in a much more effective local coping capacity and having a good adaptive capacity. So post 2018 Kerala floods, uh, there has been an initiative for a local disaster management plan, which was already explained by Nehama, and it was done by Kila and KSDMA. So I'm just revising through what she said, like few points. So all the gram panchayats, municipalities, and corporations had to prepare the plan, and they were to provide frameworks and templates and guidelines. And KSDMA provided the technical part, whereas Kila provided the capacity building and the overall coordinating role. Along with that, local resource groups with working groups conducted group discussions and data collection, focus group discussion, so that they can add to this plans. And the technical part that was mentioned by KSDMA was mostly through the 31 layers of maps, which mostly covered landslide prone areas or flood prone areas or communication facilities or infrastructure facilities. And analysis of these data were collected, and some suggestions for disaster management plans were also given. And these were discussed in Gram Sabha, and they conducted special seminars also. These are the contents. I'll tell you some specific points. So in the second chapter for climate change, there has been all these maps were given out, and also they mapped disaster risk areas word wise, saying these many number of public infrastructure, like these many number of schools, these many number of anganwadis are prone to disaster. And also at the same time, they were saying, geographically, most of the area, or the terms used were most of the area or majority of the area. The proper mapping had to be done. And and they also mentioned public infrastructure, which is uh, prone to disaster threats. So this is the one of the map provided by KSDMA. This is a flood area affected map of 2018. So, and the right side, you can see the map done by the Canal PT. So you can see the difference in the details. So a much more micro level details needs to be done for an effective disaster management. So we know that which exactly is the flood affected area. This is the transportation map. So according to this map, there is only two roads, but this is not the case. And a lot of participants are from CUSEC, and they might know that these might not be the two roads. So there are much more roads. We can see it in Google Maps also. So we need more roads so that we can know that what evacuation routes to be taken, and so these all should be done at a micro level. So what can we add to it? Like I said, a mapping at a micro level needs to be done. And secondly, I was talking about how disaster prone public infrastructure is there. So we'll look at household level vulnerability assessment or hazards that's existing. And also, we mitigation strategies are given in the disaster management plan, but adaptation strategies also needs to be given. So this will be our aim to add to the revised plan, or what we can contribute to the plan. So according to Abhilash Panda, who's a head of infrastructure resilience and deputy for intergovernmental and partnership plan at the UNDRR, which is United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, he was talking about instead capacity to manage risk rather than capacity to manage disaster, which is exactly risks leading to disaster that the local government should have. And it is everyone's business, everyone's involved in it. And good governance is related to less loss of lives, less ill, less injured, less economic loss, and less damage to the structural infrastructure. So in the end, it's all about having a plan, all about having a plan to manage the disaster which is raised by this risk and hazards we have.
I would like to recollect what Professor Shubhankar sir said about the classification of different variables that influence the risk in a particular region. That's why I'm putting the same figure here, so that he broadly discussed that the main variables that influence the risk are the threat, exposure, vulnerability. Why we are classifying these kind of variables in the form of threat, exposure, vulnerability is the broad understanding about these parameters will give us an idea about how we can manage these variables to reduce the risk in a particular region. So that for giving a more understanding about the concept, threat, exposure, and vulnerability, I am taking an example. Like we can take COVID as an example for this thing, so that if we take the threats of COVID pandemic situation, we can see that the COVID pandemic outbreak, it is itself is a threat or hazard. And the next thing is that COVID spread through air. This is another kind of threat. Even if it is a pandemic, it spread through air is another level of threat. The other thing is COVID leads to death. It is adding to the threat, like even if it is not a deadly disease, it will be not an issue like the current situation. So COVID leading to death is adding much to the threat situation. Next, we can see what are the exposure in the COVID situation. For example, if you are in a COVID affected city, it indicates a particular certain level of exposure that you are the chance of affecting the COVID. And your neighbor is COVID positive. The situation is different from you are in a COVID affected city. And other situation, you are in contact with a COVID affected patient. So these are the level of exposure we can see, and these are the examples of the exposure. And if you take the vulnerability as a situation, you can see you are healthy. That is a condition of a vulnerability. And if you are a diabetic patient, the vulnerability is changed. Your vulnerability is much more compared to the healthy person. And you are a heart patient, you can be a 60-year-old person, and you have a respiratory disorder. These are all the different levels of vulnerability. So all these variables come together in different permutations and combinations, and at some combinations are much more riskier. For example, if you look at the COVID leads to death, and you are in contact with a COVID patient, and you are having a respiratory disorder, this is the riskiest situation. Similar way, the COVID pandemic outbreak is there. you are only in a COVID affected city and you are healthy. The risk is much lesser. This is the understanding about threat exposure and vulnerability. So how we can manage the risk? So that to manage risk, we have to bring the opportunities and available resource to manage risk. For example, the same thing, if you are taking COVID, you are in a COVID affected city and COVID spread through air. These are the threats in the situation. So that how can we manage it? What are the opportunities available? For example, the mask is a cheaper material. This is an opportunity. The second thing is the sanitizer. The sanitizer will work against COVID. Also, the social distancing is a practical thing in the society. So all these are opportunities and we are using this against the threat. So that this is how we can manage the threat. The similar way we can deal with other variables like vulnerability and exposure. For example, but in our present situation, in our flood situation in Kuttanad, we can see that the hazards of threats are difficult to control or change. We can't control the change or we can't change the climate change. And the vulnerability and exposure can be reduced in a certain level. That's the possibility of these variables. And changing exposure also require more time and cooperation. For example, if a house is maybe exposed in a flood affected region, or maybe a a hazardous location. So it is not easy to remove the house from that location. That's why it requires more time and cooperation. But the vulnerabilities we can change. It is much more easier to change. That's why we are focusing much more in the vulnerability situation. But I want to say that I'm adding to it. It is only for the situation in Nedumudi or in Kuttanad. It varies upon the context. In some cases, there may be hazards also we can manage. Maybe exposure we can change. It is much easier and vulnerability is more difficult to change. The situation varies upon the context. In our particular situation, what is more easy to change is the vulnerabilities. So how we can do that? The first thing is what we need is the data. The data is the understanding about the situation and understanding about the different variables that in our location. So that we have to measure, we have to collect and measure the data from the ground through a survey. The next thing is the analysis. With the collected data, we can analyze, we can classify it as hazard, vulnerability, and exposure, and we can bring them together as risk. So that we can perform an analysis based on that, and then we can prepare a disaster management plan. For making a disaster management plan, we can also bring the resources available in the region also. So that the plan is ready, then we can bring the ASHA volunteers and local youth in the region and to make us a disaster management, local disaster management team in the region. With that team, we can execute the activities and we can monitor the task. Final thing is the monitoring of the disaster management plan. The main responsibility is for the panchayat. The panchayat can monitor all the activities and make sure that all is doing in a correct manner. Now I am bringing you to the different variables that we found from our context or found in Kuttanad. We can take the hazards in Kuttanad about flood. From the field study, we identified the flood level. This is an indicator of the hazard. Then the flood recession period. We have seen from the NC Narayan sir's presentation, the comparison of the micro flood and the macro flood. Regardless of the flash flood, the micro flood are actually stagnating more time in the region, and it is making different kind of issues related to flood. So that's why we are taking the flood recession period as a variable of hazard. The other thing is the flood occurrence period. In a year, how many floods are occurring? In 10 years, how many floods are occurring? These are the flood occurrence period. This all we can take from the field study and the meteorological data. The next thing is the remote sensing based evaluations like the topography. With the help of remote sensing, with digital elevation modeling, we can actually do the topographic modeling. So that based on the topography, we can identify the hazardous region. And the other thing is the infrastructural hazards, like the flood-inducing infrastructure that already explained by Professor NC Narayanan in his presentation, like the roads are making pools and stagnating water inside. These are the pooling infrastructure. So that with the remote sensing based analysis, we can identify these kind of threat as well. The next is the vulnerability. The vulnerability, there are 4 parts. The one is physical, economical, infrastructural, and social. And The third variable is the exposure. What are the exposure in our location? One is the land use classification. According to different land use pattern, for example, where is the house is located and where is the hospitals are located. Maybe there is a fire station there. So where is the fire station located? There may be some kind of an industry or some hazardous materials being handled. So that we have to identify all these land use classification to understand the exposure. According to the land use, the issue, the risk is varies. The next thing is the density of the building. If at some region is highly hazardous and the hazardous situation, if the exposure of high number of building in the region, it will increase the risk. If there is no building in the region in a very low topographic region, that means that region is much lesser prone to the risk. Other thing is the population density in a ward or in a panchayat. And other thing is the infrastructure. Infrastructure means the roads, the facilities like the water and sanitation facilities, the electricity facilities, the hospital. These are all part of the infrastructure. And where the infrastructure is located is highly important. That's why we are taking the infrastructure as a variable of exposure. Now we can go individually on different variables. Like we can see that how the permutations and combination of different variables interact with each other. For example, the flood level we have seen. For a high flood level region, there is high physical vulnerability and there is a high density of buildings. The situation is much riskier than any other comparison. And we can see that in a region with a very fast flood recession period, it is much safer comparing to other regions. And they have a very good economic, like where they are good in economic capabilities, and so that their vulnerability is very less and their exposure also is less, so that they are safe. So we can superimpose these variables in a map. Like we can bring the flood level, flood recession period, flood occurrence period, and topography, pooling infrastructure in the base map. Over that, we can lay the land use classification, density of building, population density, and infrastructure. So that both of this will show that which are the places coming together and making a cluster. Over that, we can put the vulnerability, like the physical, economic, infrastructure, and social, will give you a clear understanding about where the risk is located and how to deal with the risk. So this is part of our risk analysis study. So the first risk analysis, the flood level, the field study that we have conducted as part of the flood, we have identified that the red dots are showing the flood level in 2018 and blue dots are showing the in 2019. So that from this analysis, we identified that the flood level in 2018 is around 100 centimeters and in 2019 is around 50 centimeters. This is the analysis that we received from the flood level through field study. The next thing is the inundation period. Like you can see, this is a remote sensing done by a set of scientists. So we collected it from a paper so that you can see that they have collected the remote sensing data from various data from 18th August to the 26th September. During these days, they just measured the flood inundation area in the GIS tool, and you can see that the rate of reduction of flood per day is, you can see that in from 18th to 21st August, is 42 kilometers square per day. But from 21st to 27, it's only 30.2, and it is actually gradually reducing. This shows that the flood reduction is much slower during these days. This is how we can use this analysis through the remote sensing based evaluation. And here you can see from August 18, the flood level was 520 kilometers square, and it's reduced drastically to August 21. Then it slowed down, and after then then in September 26, it's only just half of the flood. This is the issue that we identified through the remote sensing based hazard analysis. Now the topography analysis we used with the digital elevation modeling. You can see that with a base map and the land use map and a drainage profile, we combined and made a base map. And we removed the paddy fields and reservoir from the map for making a better analysis of the situations. Like if the pad, we already know the paddy fields are very low topography. So that if the paddy fields are come along with the other map, most of the region, around 70 or 80% of the region will be covered with the paddy fields, and we can't identify the different variables in the region. For example, if the topography is starting from -5 to +5, that is the -5 meter to +meter 5. That is the change in levels in our location. If we can remove the paddy field from that, the variation will start from -3 or -2. So that we are able to bring a very micro level analysis of that. That's why we use that. And we used a high resolution digital elevation raster image that we received from the ALOS Pulsar mission from the Alaskan Satellite Facility. It's actually stopped the mission in 2011. So that our digital elevation modeling resolution was 12.5 meter resolution. With that resolution, we clipped the data for our land profile and we corrected for the mean sea level. And we made it to a raster to a vector, so that with a vector, we are able to make more calculations and make more, we are able to add more attributes to that. That's why we are converting it to a raster to a vector, and we made a thematic classification. Here you can see the classification we have done, and you can see the red zone showing the very low elevation zones, and the blue regions are the high topographic region. So that we can easily tell that according to the topography and hazard, this region are much safer and this region is much riskier. Next is the flood inducing infrastructure. Here you can see, here there are a road blocking a canal inside the road. And there should be culverts here. At this point, there should be a culvert. And what is the flow rate, what is the reduction in this area will indicate that how this infrastructure influencing the flood within this region. So the infrastructure itself is a risk generating infrastructure, so that we have to evaluate this infrastructure much more deeper. With remote sensing, we are also able to do that. Sometimes the hazards will come together and we can call it as a composite hazards. Here you can see this is the flood levels and this is the road. The orange lines are the roads and the blue lines are the canals. So they come together, and here you can see here is a pooling infrastructure, and within that there is a high flood level region, and there are canals also within it. So that this is the typical example of composite hazards. Now the hazard or threat part is over. Now we can come to the exposure part. The exposure part we can do with the use of land use profile. Here you can see the different classification of land use. Within the map, we can see the agricultural land, the built-up land, the paddy converted land, the wasteland, the water bodies, everything in different colors. So we are giving importance to our variable. So we removed everything else and we took the households in the region. So from the households in the density, and with that we made a heat map. So that the red spots we can see this is highly dense population region. At these points, there is a high population of houses. And what we can do is we can combine the risk profile, like the topography and the exposure together. So what will come as a result? We can see that high number of buildings with high topography, the risk will be lesser. But very low topography with a very high number of buildings, the risk is much higher. Similarly, less number of buildings and very high topography, there is no risk and this region is much safer. So how we can do in the map is, this is an example. We brought them together. This is a topography. This red spot is high, very low topography, and you can see the red color is the high housing density. So they come together and making a risk here. And from here, what we can understand is from the ground we measured all, and we were able to measure all these variables. That's why we were able to bring them together in the space. Like we were able to bring the spatiality of these things. Now, one more variable is left, that is the vulnerability. Vulnerability is the much more important variable. So here you can see this area is topographically risky and exposure is higher, like high housing density. So what the way the solution determines is the variable, like the vulnerability in the location. There may be 10 or 20 houses in the region. All these houses are not same. Each house will varies upon the level of vulnerability. So that it is important to understand and identify the vulnerabilities in the region, and we need to add that variable to it. Then only we can come to a solution. So the first thing is the physical vulnerability. So that the physical vulnerabilities depends upon the land use type. The land use type, the term that I used in the previous slide is not the same here. Here the land use type is a damage according to the land type. For example, we have seen that in Nedumudi, there may be houses in near the riverside. There may be houses inside the borders. There may be houses in the bunds, paddy fields bunds. So that each houses, the physical vulnerability is different. That's why we are taking the spatiality of the house. That's why we are using this term, the land use. Where the house is located is much more important. It's not alone the house. Where the house is located is much more important than the house own strength itself. The second thing is the house strength. House inherent properties against the disaster or defects. So that this is the sensitivity of the house, how it responds to a certain damage and based on its structural characters. So that we have to evaluate the housing properties so that we will understand the vulnerability of the house. The next thing is the health. The people living in the house, they have some physical vulnerabilities like their age, their disability, their existing health condition, maybe the chance of epidemics. These are the variables related to health. Other thing is the sanitation. The sanitation in the region, maybe the septic tank and all other facilities are highly related to the sanitation facility in the region. The Canalapis has conducted a study in 2018 and we identified that some regions that using the leach pits, like it's the most unscientific septic tank having much more disease prone areas. So this show that the sanitation facility is a physical vulnerability and how the sanitation infrastructure in a region is responding to the floods. So or how the flood sensitivity of the sanitation infrastructure in the region, that is a part of the physical vulnerability. The next thing is the economic vulnerability. In an economic vulnerability, we can take the livelihood of people. For example, what are the maybe the economic vulnerability of an agriculture worker and a government worker is different. That's why we are taking the livelihood. The second is the agriculture. Within the agriculture, there may be small farmers, there may be large farmers. In the agriculture also, there may be paddy cultivators, there may be coconut cultivators, different kind of agriculture are there. So that we have to look at the different agriculture like sectors and vulnerability of those sectors in terms of economic vulnerability. The next thing is the asset. The asset is varies upon the houses. Different houses have different level of assets. It is also a vulnerability. Next is the access to employment. You can see if some person is working in, not in Kuttanad, he is working in Cochin or somewhere, but he has to go to his work during the flood time, so that his access to the employment is highly important. So this is also come as an economic vulnerability. Next thing is the infrastructure vulnerability. The infrastructure in the region, how these infrastructure are vulnerable or sensitive to the flood. For example, the road. The roads are maybe vulnerable or not vulnerable. We have to identify that. The bunds, how the bunds varies upon the their locations. The water and sanitation infrastructure, the electricity, the shelter and relief camp, the health. All these parameters or these components are vulnerable. We have to evaluate the vulnerability of these variables. And next thing is the social vulnerability.
This part of the session is going to focus on the aspects and variables influencing the social vulnerability. So I think this is an important juncture where we need to ask the question that why do we need to talk about social vulnerability in particular. I'll come to that, but before, let me just give you two definition of social vulnerability. So the first one is social vulnerability refers to the characteristic of a person or group in terms of their capacity to anticipate, cope with, resist, and recovery from the impact of a natural hazard. And the second definition that is given by Hewitt and Blakey et al. Is social vulnerability refers to the susceptibility of social groups to potential losses from hazard events of society's resistance and resilience to hazard. So, if you look at these two definitions, we see that there are certain terms that is uh, capacity to cope or resist or recovery. And we are not talking about an entire community or entire region, but rather we are focusing on person, people, and groups instead of just talking about a community. As a homogeneous community, we are not. So, okay. So, and one thing that we keep on saying when we talk about vulnerability is, or whenever a disaster hit any particular area, is that we are all in it together. But the truth is that we are not all in it together. So, why do we say that we are not all in it together? Because different people come from different social location, and we know that in societies there are many different kind of social inequalities which exist before, during, and after the disasters. And these social inequalities basically they highlight or accentuate the problems faced by the people. So, but yeah, the question that I asked earlier, why do we need to talk about social vulnerability in particular? So, the hazard paradigm, which is dominant in the disaster management in India also, it seldom takes the social vulnerability aspect in consideration while they go for assessment of vulnerability of systems or people or household in the disaster context. So, in fact, the hazard paradigm is it is, known as very technocratic and managerial in nature. So it also treats the population and communities as if it is homogeneous. But we know that within communities also, within neighborhoods also, there are inequalities existing in the society. And so the question that that we really need to ask is, but if we are not equal, and if we are not equal, then why are we treating everybody from the same lens? And that's why, as Nida also mentioned, that micro assessment is needed. The problem with existing ways is that it does not give enough attention to the social aspect of disaster. Often the focus remains, as you can see, the dominant hazard paradigm, the focus remains on the triggering hazard. So we are just talking about whether an area or a region is prone to flood or not. But when we talk about vulnerability from a social vulnerability paradigm, we are focusing on socio-economic and political roots of those disasters. So there is an acknowledgement that the social aspect, the social power structure that exists in society, they have a very, very important role to play whenever we are talking about vulnerability. And vulnerability is not same for everyone. And the third aspect, that is the nature and extent of hazards impact, how it is going to impact, how the in our case, how flooding is going to impact different sections of the society, or how they're going to recover from it, is actually rooted in the social conditions that people live in. So next we are basically, this entire thing brings us to another point, that is the concept of differential vulnerability. Yeah. So differential vulnerability means vulnerability is dependent on the socio-economic conditions, civic and social empowerment, and access to mitigation and relief resources. So whenever we are talking about vulnerability, it is not same for everyone, even when they reside in the same area, they reside in the same biophysical characteristic. And as Rohit mentioned in one of the slides, that how different aspects of biophysical vulnerability, social vulnerability, economic, different kind of vulnerabilities, they actually exist together. It is not, generally the approach that we take is we treat them in silos, but they do not work in silos, and they are interrelated to each other. So this brings us to, we are going to talk about four aspects of social vulnerability. Yeah, four aspects of social vulnerability. So first is pre-existing social inequality. So whenever you are going to assess or map social vulnerability in any area, first aspect that we really need to be careful about is pre-existing social inequalities. We are going to elaborate on this in the further slides. Second one is the lack of resources. It can be intellectual, technological, livelihood, etc. The third one is limited access to political power and representation. And the last one is lack of social capital. So these four aspects are considered very important when we are going to map and understand social vulnerabilities, because these factors and the variables inside these aspects, they actually influence how a person or community is becomes vulnerable at the end of the day. I was engaged in Kutanad in a small research study on around 2000 in 2019 around April. So we did a research study where the objectives were we were trying to map the perceptions of people to trace the voices from various groups about their experiences during the flood and especially their understanding of the recovery process. And the second one was we were trying to understand exclusion in the recovery phase in the post flood Kutanad. So the participants of the studies were it belonged to different social, economic, age, gender, and political backgrounds. So we talked to farmers, we talked to fisher community, we talked to daily wage laborers, migrant laborers, and we talked to women, and we also talked to men. So we tried to talk to a variety of people who came from different walks of life, who came from different social locations. Our major findings of that research, so basically we're trying to understand that how dominant narratives are formed, and the narratives that people who are not residing in Kutanad, people who are outside, and through media reports we came to know about a lot of narratives. But when we went to the field and when we started talking to people, we came to know that there were multiple narratives which were which originated on the ground, but they it was not considered the dominant narrative. And those narratives which came from more powerful section of the society, they were given the mainstream, they were displayed, they were talked about, but not the ones who were at the margins. So that's a very important thing to understand. So we found that there were exclusions during the disaster. And so basically, what kind of exclusion? So first we saw there were house damage compensation. So whenever there's some section of Kutanad, we did this in Nedumudi Panchayat and Kainakeri. So we saw that there were exclusion during the house damage compensation, and the second one was material relief through non-state network, and the third one was media coverage. So few people who lived in the interior regions of Nedumudi Panchayat and also Kainakeri Panchayat, they did not receive house damage compensation on the first in the first phase. And there were few people who did not receive material relief, even though there was a large influx of material relief through both governmental government sites and non-government and civil society sites. And the third one was media coverage, what kind of news were being covered. So here, this was the three areas where the participant, they said that they felt that they were marginalized, they felt that their voices were not heard. Three reasons that they mentioned of that they mentioned was the reason of the exclusion was, first was geographical location, second one was lack of documents, and the third one was political affiliation. So geographical, we termed it geographical marginalization. We saw that the communities, the people who are residing near the paddy fields, and also the paddy fields were much deeper, so they were the lowest lying regions in Kutanad also. So that particular region was very susceptible. So we saw that because they lived in the interior regions of the panchayat, um, they were by design, or they were not accessible to the media people, to the people who were giving the relief, to the students and the volunteers who were actually assessing the house damage. So we saw that it was, first reason was because they were located in a geographically marginalized place. So the analysis was, if you look at the findings at a much superficial or surface level, you'll see that the geographical marginalization, it seems to be arising from a biophysical aspect of the disaster, right? But when we looked at who were the people who were residing in those areas, we found that it was basically majority of those people living in that area was either MG Narega worker or agricultural workers. They were not the big farmers or the powerful communities of the Kutanad region of the panchayat. And no, the other aspect was that geographical vulnerability, as I said, was also complemented with occupational marginality. So these people, they were also, during the disaster, they lost their working days for for 1, 2, 3 months, and it took a really long time for them to get back on their feet, because uh, they are basically dependent on day to day wages, and that livelihood source was completely disrupted during disaster. Okay, so the next aspect is, because we are talking about resource play a really important part whenever we are talking about recovering from a disaster. So the accessibility of resources, was it merit based, was it historical, was it based on social inequality? So we saw that it was more historical and rooted in social inequalities. I'll so we saw that there were presence of social inequalities, which actually led them which led them to a position where they were marginalized, or their narratives were not properly heard. So I'll just elaborate this point a bit, and then we can go to the next slide. So the residents of the low lying area is a case in point. The increased vulnerability of these residents towards early and extended flooding duration was, it was not surprising for anyone. These these people were also primarily daily wage workers, Manrega workers, and agriculture workers who lost their source of income almost completely during and post disaster, adding to their vulnerability. Not only they were excluded due to inaccessibility issue, but the government too shied away from compensating them for their lost days of work. Interestingly, the livelihood pattern of Kutanad economy is also intricately tied to the caste structure. So when we went to the field, these were things which were more implicit in nature instead of being explicit. Nobody talked about caste per se, but when we looked at the historical basis of the entire political economy, we found it through the literature. We got to know that it is actually tied to the caste structure. The big farmers, they were the dominant caste, they were upper caste, and Syrian Christians, while the low lying residents were primarily people from ST community and OBCs. So this arrangement and relationship was actually implicitly, I would emphasize on that, embedded in the social and economic fabric of the society. And their settlements in a vulnerable physical space is actually also tied to their livelihood option, which was they were supposed to stay near the fields because they were agriculture workers, and that area was more susceptible towards regular flooding. And so they were pushed to settle near the fields, as they were also take caretaker of the agriculture piece. So we see here that what might appear as a biophysical factor, it is actually social and economic in nature. And these are the things which our dominant disaster DRR plans, they do not, either they do not engage with it enough, or there is very least consideration or the reality which when we treat it as in a technical way, or we are just trying to looking at geographical or biophysical marginality, it is not going to give us an entire picture, a nuanced picture of the complexity which is actually present. Okay, so we talked about four aspects of social vulnerability. First one is pre-existing inequalities. So under pre-existing inequalities, these are some of the factors that you really need to be careful about when you are going to the field. First one is gender, the second one is caste, third is class, fourth is age, and fifth one is ableism. So age is slightly covered. Rohit also covered it in his presentation. Okay, so there are many challenges to measuring or mapping social vulnerability, but we have included some questions which will give us some idea about the existing social inequalities. So first we are going to ask them, um, these questions will be included in the ODK. And so number of females, or number of male, or number of third gender in the family, who does the household work? So that is an important question. Who is earning, and what is the gender of the person who is earning? If there are more than one earning member, the gender of the earning members. Is it a female or male headed household? What is the nature of employment? So these are the questions that we are going to ask with respect, and which can be analyzed or seen from a gender lens. How? So based on the response that we get, we can actually assess, and we can analyze whether the division of work in that area is gendered or not. So if you look at the literature, the question that what is the nature of employment, or is it a female headed household or not, why is it an important question? It is an important question because there's a concept of feminization of poverty. So we see that female headed households are generally more vulnerable when it comes to when compared to male-headed household, because the nature of employment that they get, the opportunities that is available for them is very much limited when compared to male. So this is the gendered aspect of division of labor or nature of employment. So that's why these questions are important. The second aspect, that as it is written, that migration or double burden of household. So we have seen it also happened in it is also happening in Kuttanan, and it happens in other disaster affected areas, that when the livelihood opportunities are disrupted, sometimes the men of the community, they decide to go out, migrate. It can be seasonal, it can be long term migration to earn money, and then women are generally left at the native place to fed themselves, and also to do the household work. So there is this double burden of both reproduction, that is the household work, emotional work, care work, and also productive activities, that is earning through livelihood. um, one aspect that is also important to understand is that in the wake of disaster, after a disaster has hit, flood, so there are different kind of traumas that people undergo, elderly, children, and even the young ones can undergo, that is both mental trauma as well as physical trauma. So in a gendered society, what happens is that the emotional work and the care work is generally given to the women. So she is already doing all the household work, and she is probably also engaged in productive work, and then the extra burden is also added to the women in the in post disaster. So all these factors make some gender more susceptible, more vulnerable than other gender, even though they belong to the same household. So it is important to understand. So now we have caste, and we have put a question on caste and religion. So probably you'll be asking this question at the end. So our idea is, if you look at these two news articles, first one is Dalit community alleges caste discrimination in Kerala flood relief camp, and the second one is how caste discrimination during and after Kerala floods has affected Dalit Adivasi. So this is also common for other areas also, but in Kutanad also, um, one of the places where discrimination based on caste happens, and it is very explicit, is when in the relief center. So some caste, they are not allowed to be a part of those relief center, because it is already inhabited by dominant caste of the region, and they don't want to eat with like in this case it was Dalit community and Adivasi. So that is why understanding and this information about caste and religion, it can be looked from the perspective of the historical analysis of that particular place, how caste has developed, or how what is the religious dynamic of that place, and both of these kind of data analysis can be seen together to understand that how, whether a household can be more vulnerable, or a person is more vulnerable because of these aspects, which are very much there in the society, but is not considered important when we start assessing vulnerability. So in caste, we are also asking the question, yeah. So um, we have included one question: do you move to relief camps during flood reasons? So as I already mentioned, that the reason can be varied, but engaging with the question of whether people like to move to relief camps, if yes, why, if not, why, can give us some idea about, is there a caste dynamic or caste aspect related or associated with that? Is there some kind of caste or community based discrimination that is happening there, which is not probably it would not be explicit to an outsider's eye? So there are some castes which are associated with different with specific occupations. So we can see those patterns through surveys and through more in-depth engagement. And if that particular occupation is vulnerable, that means those most of the people, if for certain occupation which is much more vulnerable, and there is one or two castes which are heavily employed in those occupations, that means that occupational vulnerability, which might look as just an occupational vulnerability, will also be because of the caste aspect of it. Geographical location, as I already mentioned, that in Kutanad we saw that those people who were living near the paddy fields, they were agricultural laborers, and also they were people from SC community and OBC. Yeah. now we come to class. So class also becomes an important aspect, and we are going to ask questions like what is the ration card type, APL, BPL, Antyodaya, General. So poverty is also linked to vulnerability. It is not synonymous to vulnerability, but being a poor really puts you on spot, and it increases your vulnerability manifold when compared to people who are not poor. Then there is level of education, family income, employment. All of this can give you an idea. Um, all of this can give you an idea about whether the household or the people are poor or not. And what is the nature of employment? Nature of employment can give us idea about uh, whether the job provides security or not, whether the labor is precarious, the precarity of labor is there or not. So there are some jobs which are more insecure. The duration of employment can also tell you if a person is just employed for 100 days out of 365 days, and if there's a person who is a government employee, so the government employee will have some kind of security, some kind of cushion when disaster hits. But a person who is just employed for a few days, and that too it is not secure, then that definitely puts the person with less number of working days and more precarious and more insecure job on a tougher spot. So the question that we are going to ask is number of how how many elderly are there in the house, what are their ages, are they suffering from any health conditions, um, and if yes, then what are the different kind of health conditions that they are suffering from? It can be physical, it can be cognitive activities. So we during my field work I saw that there was one particular household where there was a woman. She was around 80 years old and she did not have anyone around. Like, she was the only person living in her house, and she could not get rescued on the first day when the flood happened, because she did not have anyone in her house, and that made her, and also because she had problems with mobility and listening, so she had such issues. So she did not get the information. Nobody came to ask for her, and it was only after the second day that she was rescued, when the neighbors, they realized that this woman has not been rescued yet. So her age, you know uh, uh, her she was around 80, and that put her in a very difficult situation, and that made her more vulnerable when compared to other people who are living in the same neighborhood. Related aspect is also ableism. So ableism is also a very important aspect of uh, understanding vulnerability. So people with disabilities, we call them people with disabilities. It can be both mental as well as cognitive as well as physical. So according to Disability Census 2015, if you look at Social Justice Department, around 2.23% of the people living in Kerala, they are people with living with disabilities. It's an important figure. So the question that we are going to ask is, how many people with, is there any person with disabilities in the household? If yes, how many are there? How, what kind of disability are they facing? Is it motor disability or is it cognitive disability? I mean, it is no, we can understand only by talking about it, that people with underlying health conditions are more susceptible, and especially in flood, if their mobility is restricted, if their cognitive ability is restricted, then that makes them more vulnerable. How can this data help us? So in planning for vulnerability, or disaster planning in case of flood. So first of all, it will help the local governance institution, the local panchayat, to locate those households and those individuals which are which have people with disabilities at their home, and then they can be included in such a way that targeted assistance can be given to them. The second aspect is, we know that one of the reasons why they their mobility is restricted, because their infrastructure, the infrastructure that is developed around us, the physical infrastructure, and especially the man-made infrastructure, they're not designed keeping in mind people with disabilities or elderly people. So having this kind of information, having this kinds of sensitivity in the disaster planning at the panchayat level, at the local governance level, can also help local panchayats to integrate such data in the flood planning and also in panchayat development plans.
So now we will discuss the lack of resources, which is the second aspect of social vulnerability. So Kanishka has mentioned about caste, class, age, ableism, gender, how these aspects, how these pointers are contributing in terms of more vulnerable more social vulnerability. And these all firstly point out to the lack of resources. It can be intellectual, related to knowledge, or the technology, the new technology in the town, or livelihood opportunities we have. So all these and the crucial resources we have. So we need some resources, some intellectual idea, or the knowledge we have to gain, informations, livelihood aspects. So all these have a repercussion on our daily material dimension of social inequalities. So yes, lack of resources. So one thing is the livelihood opportunity. If you don't have a proper livelihood or a secure job or secure livelihood, that will be one of the social vulnerability, which first of all, because that also depends on the economic vulnerability you have. You don't have money, you will be underrepresented. So that is the major, livelihood is major point in terms of lack of resources. And next is land availability. So land availability can both ways. So if you have a bigger land area, you can cultivate that land. So land is a natural resource. And if you are short of that land, even the space for toilet construction, you may not have. So the lack of land resource make you vulnerable in terms of other aspects. For example, the example given is toilet construction. Also, the lack of information. If you don't have a proper, for example, the Nedumudi Grama Panchayat made a disaster management plan. And if not all the people will be aware of that. So again, some problem comes or a flood comes, inundation comes. What you need to do? It didn't reach you. The planning and the policy, the ground level, how to work plan didn't reach you. The standard operating procedure didn't reach you. So how will you manage? And ultimately, you are vulnerable to that particular disaster. Also, the absence of different institution. It also depends on the geographical location you have. The health facility, if it is not nearby, so you are vulnerable to, for example, in a case of emergency, you get a health emergency too, because of fear or because of weather change. So how will you cope with that? So that will increase your vulnerability. It can be a double disaster for you. So that is another resource, the health infrastructure, the facility nearby, and the limited access to new technologies. So many of the people today also, there is a lack of phone or any other gadget, which is very crucial for their life during the flood times. So the limited access to new technologies and understanding to use it also goes, for example, it can be a vehicle. So these all, transportation is another lack of resources. So if you're only using a public transportation, that can also be a vulnerability. The next aspect is political power and representation. So the lack of resources is correlated to poor political power. So if you haven't represented enough, I mean, for example, if you're an differently able person. So the Kerala State Disaster Management Authority in their plan have specifically mentioned how the differently able should be taken care. And many of our schools after 2018, when the reconstruction happening, we have many of the areas in the schools where the wheelchair can be taken up. Otherwise, we have only steps. So now we have ramp. So these things are only understood when you have a proper representation in the political body and in terms of political power. So it doesn't mean that all the differently able, most of the differently able should be coming to the as an elected representative, but your representation should be there in order to voice what exactly needed in terms of a vulnerable situation. So the example is then in Kutanad, another example is that daily wage laborers, based on the study conducted earlier, the daily wage laborers found themselves politically inept in voicing their, in telling, taking up their voices in the panchayat in the recovery phase. So it is important during the recovery phase also, recovery planning, recovery, what is the amount to be distributed. At all these places, you need the representation. So basically there are 4: mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. All the four demand you representation in political power and representation, which makes things easier for you. Otherwise, there also the vulnerability is on high. So we'll go to a social capital definition a little bit. So as per Putnam, so all the three definitions given here have social networks in common. So basically, social network and norms that facilitate our action, cooperation. So we can see that during the flood happened, after the flood, after rescue happened, we have to recover from it, reconstruct it, and people from across the state have come to Alapi, Pathanamthitta, and other district which was severely affected due to flood. So that kind of a networking, social network in the broader sense, it comes to that, because all were together when we are saying we were able to do some kind of it. But at the same time, if the place is very interior, many of the volunteers didn't reach. So that was given in the news also, that interiors many volunteers haven't reached. So that also depends on the physical geography, the geographical location, but mainly the social network is very important in terms of all these aspects. So the another definition is that social capital is a resource for individual and represent the resource available to social network. So all this definition focus on the point of social network you have. It can be a personal or it can be a community based. So one of the central aspect of social vulnerability is social capital. So the lack of social capital will lead to exclusion. So like Kanishka mentioned, the 80-year-old woman, she also had some underlying health issues. She was staying alone. There was no family members along with her. But if she had a good social capital or the relation with the neighbors, at least she might have taken care a little bit more into. So the social capital, the network, the point which I mentioned is a personal individual failure to have a social connection. But in terms of, for example, in a paddy field area or an agriculture area, people have immediate social connection with other farmers or other members. They may not be also knowing very well how to combat, how to manage the risk when a flood is coming, when a tsunami is coming, or when a cyclone is coming. So what is your social capital will ultimately decide your social vulnerability. And poor relief and rescue opportunity, like I earlier mentioned about when cleaning people comes, when the people come, volunteers come for cleaning, they, due to their geographical location and the power representation in power representation, they also pulled back in that terms also. So no resource sharing. There can be a conflict between two communities nearby that also will hinder the rescue efforts. So there are many things which we don't see directly, but there are underlying. We have to we can't quantify all those things. So a ward member or a person who is working on ground level, for example, Kudumbashri ADS person, can know these things better. And the presence of this social capital will help us in mitigation, adaptation, preparedness, evacuation, all the aspects of a disaster, recovery, relief, rescue. So next slide. So all these points are very important because the social aspect is in order to reduce the social vulnerability, that is very important to look at each of the aspects. And from the case of Kuttanad, we can say, like in any area where the inundation happens, so education of children. So the parents will have a fear of children will fall into the inundated area. So they go along with them, stay there in the school till the evening. So one day of the parent is also gone. So that affects their livelihood. This is from the case from Kuttanad also. So, and another thing is a higher educational qualification that is related to the power aspect, the class aspect of the family or the aspect of the person. So another thing is that family relation. We may think that these are small things, but the marriage proposal rejection that may affect your mental health as well as the sense of a place that you are living in Kuttanad for so long. And ultimately, when your marriage age comes, you have been, you are not getting a good alliance because of the physical vulnerability, and which in turn become your social vulnerability. So also visiting and caring the elder family members. So not all people, so we have nuclear families now. So not all the people are in a joint family. So your family members who may be staying in a nearby place. So the care always, the care is always needed during a disaster and after the disaster, because many a place the elder people are more vulnerable to mental health issues caused by the disasters. So this also affect the family relation. So both this education and family related issue, for example, marriage proposal, will ultimately lead to a oldest adaptation of measure of humanity, which is migration. So there can be seen increased cases of migration in Kutanad also. So we have to also look into that factor. What are the main reason? Is it just the flood, or is it just the underlying social vulnerability in Kutanad which is leading to the migration? So the increasing migration in Kutanad can be a effect of a differential vulnerability, which Kanishka mentioned earlier. That means each person, one person may be able to pay the rent in Alapi and move to Alapi by leaving his home here. So there are many cases which happen like that. But it is also heard that earlier there were chances for people to get the money from the government and leave the house. But that time, the 2018 and 2019 flood were not there, and people stayed back. But there is an increased risk perception. There is an increased tensions of climate change and flood now among the people. So that making them to migrate more into the cities. So these all are, we can't quantify those things, and we can't directly understand from the map or a physical vulnerability aspect. So we need to consider, and also next slide, we have we need to do it in a qualitative sense. Qualitative means we can't number it, we can't quantify it, but there are methods coming up which can also quantify those social vulnerabilities. But we are not sure how much we can understand that kind of social vulnerability to address those. So it is the challenge of social vulnerability mapping. It is difficult to quantify, like physical vulnerability or biophysical vulnerability, and it is implicit to each community. They may not tell you the vulnerabilities. Most people don't want to tell about their negative sides or the underlying issues they have. So this all known to the people immediate to them. So that's why there is a emphasis on ward level disaster or the community based local level disaster management plan. So that all connects together, and I think that was a good effort, great effort by the Kerala State and Kila and other departments to come up with. So also Canalpi is involved in Nedumudi Gram Panchayat, and also looking at some of the social vulnerabilities underlying in that. So the focus group discussion, which already mentioned by Gitu and Drishya, was also important. We need to understand what exactly is their problem and overcome along with the structural measures we are doing from with the help of civil engineering department or students and faculties and all the others. We have to focus on to understand it from a social perspective also will help all of us to contribute more for the mapping exercise in Kutanad.
So once we are done with all the data accumulation, which is mostly done by remote sensing and GIS, household survey, focus group discussions, and more ward level participatory appraisal, rural appraisal, these all data will together give us hazards, vulnerability, and exposure. And this, along with resources and opportunities, will give into the local level disaster management plan. Now, let's say there are some students who are doing some projects or studies related to some or the other factors involved affecting flood. For example, the causes of micro floods or the effects of it or the impact of it. This can also be contributed to local level disaster management plan, so that it's more detailed. Now, what will be the benefits of this? So we'll have an evacuation plan, and once we are done with the vulnerability group, once we know the vulnerability group or hazards or vulnerable areas, we can plan the evacuation actions with priority. which area needs more priority, and even remedial actions can also taken in the high risk regions. And we'll have a more deeper understanding of the risks happening at the local level, and all the variables like what is hazard, what is vulnerability, and what is exposure, and how that's going to affect us. We'll have a much better understanding of that. And at the same time, local actors will be enabled to plan resources so that all these variables, hazard, vulnerability, exposure, can be managed. And these activities can also be prioritized. And once we have this contextual understanding of the situation, a local level policies can be devised rather than state level, and which can actually cater to the district level plans or state level plans. So in the beginning, I have said that it was a more of a top down approach. So now we are going for a bottoms up planning and policy making by understanding local level issues. Next. So what will be the outcome of all this? So we'll have a decision making document which will help in disaster management, flood related disaster management. And we can revise the existing panchayat level disaster management, but when we contribute more to it, we can have revisions, and these revisions can be done frequently. And there are templates given to various to all the panchayats also. This can also be upgraded by adding more adaptation and mitigation measures. And this methodology can be scaled up to other panchayats, but of course looking at their context also, but it can be scaled up using the similar methodology. So uh, when we have this report, we'll have these details, details of the threats and vulnerabilities and hazards within the regions, and who will be the vulnerability groups, which are the areas, vulnerability areas will be mapped. And we'll see if we can quantify these vulnerabilities so that we can prioritize these areas or groups. And we can give recommendation for public interventions that can be through adaptive measures for reducing these vulnerabilities, how to do rehabilitation activities, how infrastructure like water, electricity, and accessibility to various infrastructure can be made better, how to create assets, how rebuild programs can be devised, and how livelihood programs can be supported, and how if any structures are vulnerable, how structural what kind of structural interventions can be given, or wherever non-structural interventions are important, how that can be done, and if there can be any land use policies to be done. And guidelines can also be done, especially in case of evacuate. This is mostly the post disaster area evacuation, how to manage relief camps, and also how to do post flood rehabilitation or reconstruction activities. So once we have this winter school report, our process will be to give it to the panchayat, and panchayat, with the help of ASHA workers and other volunteers or other supporting groups, can do the monitoring and evaluation so that the plan can be revised again and again when it's needed. And we can have vulnerability assessment, and also vulnerability records can be maintained. So for scaling up, once we are done with one panchayat, we can actually scale up to other panchayats. So this scaling up can be done by local students or local colleges who can mobilize themselves and have resources for data collection. And task force can be capacitated for making these jobs easier and have an effective management. And local disaster expert groups can be created at what level or at panchayat level, so they can be responded to disaster first. And then like I said before, there can be frequent vulnerability reports and vulnerability records can be maintained so that we can see that if there is improvement or anything else.